Today we will talk about two chilling stories from deep underground caves, where darkness is complete and every step is a struggle. In the first, a skilled diver faces deadly challenges in a narrow, icy shaft. In the second, another diver gets trapped in a tight, silt-filled passage blocked by fallen rock. Both stories show how quickly adventure can turn to nightmare in these silent, cold places deep beneath the earth. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On a cold September morning in 2008, British diver John Manley stepped into the icy waters of the Source de Doubs, unaware that this dive would become the most mysterious of his life. Hidden in the Jura Mountains of eastern France, Little Siberia is known for extreme cold and heat. Near the town of Mouthe, the Source de Doubs cave system lies 935 meters above sea level. Its water stays a constant 6 degrees Celsius and feeds the Doubs River. The cave is divided into three sections: S1, S2, and S3, with increasing danger and unknown depths. Since 1969, explorers have pushed past barriers, extending the cave to over a kilometer long. John Manley, born in 1976, was a bright and curious student who loved adventure and nature. He worked at Ricardo Engineering but lived for excitement outside of work. His true passion was diving, exploring both the sea and deep caves. He trained with Brighton's Sub-Aqua Club and pushed into dangerous cave systems in the UK and France. He always returned with thrilling stories, until one final dive in France changed everything. On September 28, 2008, John Manley entered the Source de Doubs alongside two trusted certified diver friends, John Valanthan and Charles Reed Henry, determined to reach its deepest known point. Their plan was to dive autonomously. No partners, no safety support, just a diver and the cave. John Manley brought with him an enormous piece of equipment strapped to his chest, a large closed-circuit rebreather, heavy and bulky. It allowed longer dives, but in tight spaces it was a ticking liability. The night before the dive, his friends warned him, "That rebreather is too big, it might not fit through the cave's tighter passages." But John had made up his mind. He wasn't going to change his gear. Not for this dive. Not for anyone. In 1998, John broke his back in a violent motorcycle crash, and the pain never truly left him. That injury would follow him into the cave. The entrance to Source de Doubs doesn't look deadly. It's narrow, just 3.5 meters wide, around 11 feet, surrounded by moss, limestone, and dripping silence. But it leads into a dark underworld shaped by centuries of water erosion. John moved slowly, edging forward, careful not to wedge his rebreather against the rough stone. Each movement was deliberate. The passage sloped downward, growing colder with every foot. Visibility shrank. The water turned from a pale blue to inky black. After about 13 meters, 43 feet, John reached the upper ledge overlooking a deep shaft known as S3. As he began his descent, the water grew darker, colder. John adjusted his mask, checked his oxygen, then he dropped in. The shaft pulled him downward. The beam from his flashlight cut through suspended silt, revealing nothing but narrow walls and darkness. It was the kind of environment where one wrong move, one broken line, one jammed valve, meant death. But John wasn't a beginner. He had trained for years, and yet he was descending alone with oversized gear into a cave his peers had warned him not to enter like this. He continued deeper into the Fretic tunnel, navigating steep drops and uneven rock formations. The water was ice cold, the walls slick. At 322 meters, 1,056 feet, he finally reached the shaft floor, a cramped, shadowy space cluttered with jagged rocks and heavy, blocky debris blocking a large hole ahead. To his right, a narrow crevice squeezed upward, leading into an uphill passage barely wide enough to slip through. John's gloved hand brushed against the cave floor, disturbing thick sediment that instantly clouded the water. The murky silt swirled around him, turning the water into a dense, ghostly fog. Visibility dropped sharply. Every careful fin kick stirred up more particles, blurring his path. The cold water pressed against him, the damp cave walls closing in, tight and unforgiving. Despite the choking haze and tight space, John's focus never wavered. He knew the risks. The slightest mistake here could be deadly. But the fragile beauty of the underwater cave caught his eye. Moving deeper into the submerged maze, John caught sight of a narrow opening on the left-hand side, barely noticeable in the murk. It curved toward the valley side, a tight, winding tunnel known to few. This passage had a history. In 2002, Divers had slightly enlarged it with tools, not for exploration but for survival. It had once been a bottleneck, a trap. Now John faced it alone. The opening was narrow and almost shoulder width, and the rock pressed in like jagged teeth. He adjusted the bulky rebreather on his chest, took a steadying breath, and inched forward. Every move was slow, deliberate. His fins barely flicked, avoiding the walls to keep from stirring more silt. The water was colder here, the silence heavier. He checked his depth gauge, glanced at his air supply, then pushed deeper. This wasn't just any side tunnel. It ran directly beneath the known bottom of S3, but a violent collapse had buried the first 30 meters, 98 feet, of its original structure. John swam through a corridor of debris. Slabs of broken stone loomed overhead like the ribs of a fallen beast. But then, light from his torch caught open water ahead. He kicked through one final squeeze and emerged, shaken but intact. 555 meters in, 1,821 feet from the surface. John reached what divers called the first major fold zone. The passage twisted ahead, sloping steeply like a stone slide carved by time. As he swam forward, his light flickered over gravel banks, piled up like sunken dunes. Some patches were unstable, and others blocked further progress. But John didn't force it. He hovered, scanning the terrain. He had come far, farther than most, and he was content with that. He checked his pressure gauge again. The needle edged toward its safety threshold. It was time. Time to go back. Following the sacred rule of thirds, 1/3 of air for the descent, 1/3 for the return, and 1/3 as emergency reserve, John began his ascent. But even as he turned, he paused. Suspended in the cold, silt-laced water, he took in the sight, the way the rock shimmered under torchlight, the silence that felt infinite. It wasn't just danger that brought him here. It was this, the raw, alien beauty. This dive would stay with him forever. With a final glance behind him, John began to retrace his path. The journey back was no less demanding. He moved slowly, passing familiar landmarks. The gravel ridges, the collapsed walls, the narrow chutes. Eventually, he reached the edge of S2, the section just before the final ascent. But the way out was far from simple. Massive boulders blocked the exit, forming tight, angular crevices. Just enough space to slip through, but not without risk. One wrong move and he could knock a stone loose, or trap himself. Every motion had to be calculated, every fin kick precise. No room for panic, no margin for error, and John knew it. During his way in, John had already struggled. The tight, jagged spaces had pushed his massive rebreather to its limits. Now, on the return, with fatigue setting in and space narrowing, he made a decision, one that would change everything. He unstrapped the rebreather, carefully, deliberately. It was the only way to squeeze through the tightest pinch point. He slipped forward, the cold rock scraping against his suit, and grabbed a secondary bottle to breathe from. For a moment it worked, but when he tried to strap the rebreather back on, it wouldn't fit. The walls were too close. His injured back, stiff, uncooperative. He twisted, fought, tried again. Nothing. He was wedged in a place not meant for bulky equipment, or for mistakes. So John made a call. He'd ascend without the rebreather, just the bottle tucked under his arm. But halfway up, disaster struck. The bottle slipped. The rubber hose tore from his mouthpiece. Just like that, no air. He was still deep, still far from safety. Panic surged. In the murky water, John scrambled, searching, heart racing, hands flailing through sediment. But the bottle was gone. The silence of the cave closed in, and somewhere in that cold, flooded shaft, John blacked out. Back at the surface, John Valanthan and Charles Reed Henry waited. Minutes passed, then hours, no sign. They knew something was wrong. They re-entered the cave, hearts heavy, lights piercing the dark. Down the main shaft, through the cold silence, they searched. Then, 26 meters below, beneath a rock ledge, they found him, still and unresponsive. They carefully brought John to the surface, where firefighters immediately began resuscitation efforts. They gave him oxygen, tried CPR, did everything they could, but nothing worked. It was too late. John Manley, just 32 years old, a diver, an explorer, a man driven by wonder, was gone. Despite his skill and determination, a single miscalculation in a hostile environment proved fatal. But unlike John, Eric got trapped in a tight, silt-filled passage blocked by fallen rocks, where every breath was a fight for survival. It was October 3rd, 2010, a calm Sunday morning in southern France. Eric, a 46-year-old cave diver and underwater engineer, had done this hundreds of times. But this time, he wouldn't know that a simple dive would turn into a fight for survival deep inside the cave's unforgiving depths. Dragonnière Cave is a maze of tight, silty tunnels where visibility drops to near zero, and even a small movement can stir up blinding clouds. Hidden air pockets may offer false hope, some filled with toxic gases that can paralyze or kill. On October 3rd, Eric Establis entered Dragonnière Cave alone, determined to explore parts no diver had mapped before. Loaded with an array of equipment strapped tightly to his body, he planned a dive that would last 6 hours deep beneath the Earth's surface. At first, the dive went smoothly. The cold water closed in around him, and the rough limestone walls glistened faintly in the beam of his flashlight. But as Eric moved deeper, trouble began. His movement stirred the fine silt on the cave floor, turning the water around him into a thick, muddy cloud. Visibility vanished. Caught in a silt blackout, Eric could no longer see the passage ahead, or the guide rope that would lead him home. Every step became a cautious guess. Navigating blindly, he pressed on, battling the choking darkness and shifting debris. Unexpected obstacles loomed in the tunnel, sharp rocks, narrow squeezes, and sudden drops that tested his skill and nerves. Finally, Eric noticed massive stones had collapsed. He was trapped on the wrong side, surrounded by utter darkness. With his air supply steadily running out, panic was not an option. Faced with few choices, Eric made a desperate decision. He removed some of his equipment and carefully left them behind. It was a silent signal, a hope that rescue teams would find these markers and understand he was still fighting to survive. When Eric Establis failed to return from Dragonnière Cave, concern quickly turned into alarm. Back on the surface, his absence triggered an international rescue response. Among the first to answer the call were two experienced cave divers, Rick Stanton and John Valanthin. Known for their role in high-profile rescues, the British and Swiss divers wasted no time. They flew in with specialized gear ready to descend into the pitch-black maze that had swallowed Eric. Standing at the narrow, rocky entrance of the Dragonnière system, Rick and John knew what waited below. Silt-choked water, jagged walls, claustrophobic tunnels where one wrong move could mean zero visibility and zero chance of turning back. But they also knew time was slipping away. Suited up with rebreathers, extra tanks, and waterproof packs full of first aid supplies, they began their descent. Inch by inch, they glided through the flooded chambers, their helmet lights slicing through the thick, coffee-colored water. Each flick of a fin sent clouds of silt swirling. Visibility dropped to inches. By the time they reached 2,427 feet into the cave, it was clear why the water was so murky. An underwater avalanche had churned up the mud lining the floor. Fine sediment floated everywhere, coating their masks and lights, making it nearly impossible to see. Still, they pushed forward, feeling their way along the guideline. Then came the barrier, a jagged rockfall blocking the main tunnel. Just beyond they knew might be Eric, but the only opening was a tight hole in the rubble, barely large enough for a single diver to squeeze through. They tried, but with their bulky rescue packs and oxygen gear, it was impossible. The passage was too narrow, too unstable. Worse, their air gauges were dropping fast. Kicking slowly in the cold, dark water, they made their way up, empty-handed. After the failed first attempt, hope still clung to the surface. Thin, but not gone. Armed with everything they had learned, Rick Stanton, John Valanthin, and the rest of the team regrouped. New strategies formed. New gear was prepped, and this time, they weren't going in alone. Above ground, the rescue effort expanded. Civil engineers arrived to help tackle a critical obstacle, a vertical shaft too narrow to navigate. In the trench carved by the engineers, rescuers broke into a natural fissure, a slim vertical crack in the bedrock that led into a narrow, twisting corridor. Inside, they found a tight aperture that looked promising. Barely shoulder width, but possibly connected to a dry, air-filled chamber deeper within the cave system. It was their best lead yet, and if Eric was alive, he might be somewhere beyond that opening, waiting. At the same time, another team explored a neighboring cave system, poring over geological data that hinted at a possible underground link. If they could find a natural tunnel connecting to Dragonnière Cave, it might offer an alternate path to Eric, a way in or a way out. Below ground, conditions had finally shifted in their favor. The once thick sediment that clouded every chamber had settled. Visibility improved. Now, the Swiss diving team geared up for a second attempt. This time, they were joined by elite divers Pedro Barlotti and Luigi Castelli. With visibility improved and using slimmer, low-profile gear, They aimed to push deeper, into places they couldn't reach before. As they approached the rockfall again, their lights swept carefully across the jumble of boulders and broken slabs. Then, something metallic glinted beneath a slab. It was Eric's emergency scooter wedged between slabs. The sight hit them hard. He had made it this far. And more than that, he had abandoned his propulsion device, the one thing that made retreat easier. That meant one thing. Eric had attempted to crawl through. Just past the scooter, they found the scuffed rock and scrape marks that told the rest of the story. A narrow gap near the rockfall's top, barely passable. But it wasn't completely blocked. It was a lead. They surfaced and regrouped. A third dive was necessary. After resupply, Rick and John descended again, this time with intent. They moved carefully, inching toward the gap. One wrong movement could send the clouds of silt billowing up, blinding them in seconds. But they had studied the path. They were ready. At the rockfall, they hovered silently, then slipped into the narrow crack, one at a time. The rock scraped against their shoulders. Their tanks bumped the ceiling. Every breath was measured, every movement deliberate. But then, the tunnel widened. They emerged into a new chamber, unexplored, unlit, undisturbed. They were hopeful that Eric Establi might be somewhere ahead, waiting. Soon after, their lights caught something below, 15 feet down, motionless in a narrow chute. It was Eric. The depth surprised them. He had pushed toward what he must have hoped was a pocket of air, but the effort had fallen heartbreakingly short. After 10 days of navigating shifting rock and ink-black tunnels, they had found him. Getting to him, however, was nearly impossible. The space was brutally tight, the angles too steep. They adjusted gear, tried different approaches, but the rock wouldn't yield. Each attempt only heightened the risk. In the end, with heavy hearts, they had to make the call. They couldn't bring him out. Instead, they focused on what was still within reach. Eric's dive computer, strapped securely to his gear, held the record of his final dive. They removed it with care. That single device could explain his last moments in a way no one else could. Even leaving the cave was a struggle. Their air reserves were low, and the way out was long and punishing. Step by step, breath by breath, they made it back to the entrance and handed the device over to the authorities. The computer's data painted the full picture. Eric had kept going until the very end. Though the official search closed on January 8, 2011, the effort didn't stop there. French speleologists continued working in silence, drilling through rock, hoping one day to reach him and bring his body back. Though he never returned, his story echoes through every chamber he braved.